Great to see everybody here today. My name is Adam Grinold, Executive Director of the Brattleboro Development. If you didn't hear me introduce myself earlier, thank you all for being here. I want to thank M&T as our sponsor for this session. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of sponsors. They are essential for this event, so please be sure to reach out and mention any of the folks that you see from any of those organizations. So today we've got a great panel, a great topic, a lot to cover. We will probably have to condense this at the end. We won't make it through the planned comments because we really want to make sure we save some time for Q&A. So I'll just keep my eye on the time and make sure we drive to that goal. So we've got this discussion today on what is a rural economy. Our goal is to sharpen our understanding of what defines a small rural economy or an economy at large, who holds the levers to influence it, and how strategy, just not circumstance, can ensure a thriving community. So we're joined by our panelists who bring a very unique Vermont experience to this conversation. So each of the panelists is going to introduce themselves, speak to what they will be bringing to today's conversation. We're going to go into a series of questions and discussion, and then Q&A. So I'm going to start by, is there one mic? I'll just hand this off. Okay, you guys want to share that? So we'll go to one end and start with Vermont State Treasurer Mike Pichak.
Why, thank you, Adam. I know. Right there. There we go. How about that?
I'll figure it out because this one's working.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's great to be here with everybody this morning. I'm Mike Pichak, a Vermont State Treasurer. Art Wolf has given me good political advice to stand up.
I'm not running again.
It's really nice to be here with everybody. And, I think answering Adam's question about our background and about this panel discussion, I think for me it's a little bit interwoven. I grew up in Brattleboro. And yeah, there you go. And I remember growing up in Brattleboro, and a lot of the lessons that my parents taught me, which, maybe at the time I didn't appreciate, were kind of economic lessons. But my dad's a small business owner. He owns an accounting firm in Brattleboro. He had a lot of small businesses in town that were his clients. And he always impressed on me the importance of supporting those local businesses. We had to buy things locally. I had to go to the Galantis sports shop and buy my basketball sneakers there, even though they only had in size 14, they only had white or black. So I didn't have a lot of options. We had to go to the diner at the end of the main street, even though I didn't particularly like the food, But they were a client of my dad's, and we had to support them. We had to support the local business because they supported him and they supported our family. So that idea of supporting each other and keeping your money local and keeping that money local so that it can grow and compound and have more of an impact is something that was really important in a small town, in a rural town in Vermont. And I think over the ensuing decades, we've seen changes to that model that unfortunately have made some of our communities less wealthy. They've put challenges on our communities. Those local stores, those local businesses that provided really solid middle-class lifestyles for a lot of people in those communities have become regional or national, or they've closed. They haven't been able to find the next generation to take over those businesses, and they've gone away. So it has become more challenging, I think, in a place like Brattleboro, as I watch it over the years, to maintain that same kind of economic vibrancy and same kind of economic dynamic upward mobile economic trajectory for individual people and families. And that's something that we have to really hit on and think about. For me, we'll talk a lot more about this, but for me, the way to address that in this moment is thinking about how do we make Vermont more achievable, more affordable for people to live here, to stay here, to be able to, young people to be able to grow up here and have a career here. And then for me, it comes back to making more housing available for people of all incomes, all backgrounds, all types. That's the most important thing from an economic standpoint, and most important thing, I think, from a social standpoint as well. So look forward to talking about that today, and look forward to being here with everybody this morning. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Art Wolf. I'm a retired professor at economics at UVM. I started teaching there in 1980. In 1988, I answered a want ad in the Burlington Free Press. Some of you may remember want ads. Some of you may remember a newspaper. Wanted economist. The governor's office was looking for an economist. I said, that looks interesting. And I applied and got the job and was the state economist for Madeline Kunin from 1988 until the end of her term in 1991. When Dick Snelling took over, he abolished that position as a cost-cutting measure. So I was the last official state economist for the governor. I knew nothing about the Vermont economy. I learned a lot because I had to advise the governor on it. It was probably the best career move I ever made. It changed my whole trajectory of research. And when I left the office and went back to UVM, I said, gee, if the governor thought I had something to say about the Vermont economy, maybe other people will also think that. So I started with my business partner, the Vermont Economy newsletter, which was a monthly newsletter on the state economy, which we published for about 25 years. And I got very interested in economic journalism and just kind of trying to explain the economy to people who didn't really understand it. And that was kind of like what I did to legislatures who didn't know much about economics either. And so I wrote a column for the Burlington Free Press for about 8 years or so in the 2000s. And then I wrote for VT Digger for about 2 years, a regular column for them. I'm very interested in communicating economics to people who have either never taken an economics course or even worse, took one and just regretted it ever since. So what I'm going to talk about when it comes down to the actual substance, I want to talk about what is a local economy? How do we talk about or think about a local economy in the context of a state economy, a national economy, and an international economy, which we are, I used to say increasingly part of, but the increasingly really doesn't exist anymore because we are part of it. We have been for a long time. When I started talking about the economy to people said, well, back in the Depression, Vermont was self-sufficient and the Depression really didn't hurt Vermont. It did. We back in the 1930s, we hurt like everybody else. The number of farms I think went in half, and that was when a huge percent of Vermont's population, about 30%, lived and worked on farms. But now we are fully integrated. What happens all over the world affects us, and what happens in Vermont affects us. So how do we think about that, and how do our actions reflect that? And then I'd like to talk about how do we define success? What does it mean to have a successful economy? And also, if we're trying to plan for the future and adapt, as the speakers talked about this morning, how do we know if we've succeeded, and what happens if we make a mistake? What happens if what we thought was going to be very successful for our economy turns out not to be? And I'll give you kind of an extreme case, but maybe not, and maybe this will help you think. Probably if we were doing this the first year they had this summit 8 years ago, we talk a lot about local economy, buy local, right? That's like what we all think is so great. And I didn't see any of the panels today that are talking about buying local. And I would submit to you that if you think buying local is still good, I think you may be in the same boat as our current president. Because one way you can encourage people to buy local, if we define local as just the United States, is to put up very high tariff walls. So we buy local in the United States, and that will be good for us, because we won't be dependent on anybody outside of our local United States area. And I think most of you would think that if we define buying local as just the United States, and a good tool to accomplish that is putting high tariff walls on our friends and whoever our enemies are these days, that might not be such a good idea. So I like to be provocative.
Hi everyone, I think this is the right time to out myself as someone who actually never took an econ class in college. So my name is Kevin Chu, I'm the executive director of the Vermont Futures Project. I like to say I grew up in Vermont, I want to grow old here too. I'll share a little bit about my personal background and then say a few words about the Futures Project. So I'm the son of immigrant parents. My parents moved from Southeast China back in 1986, ended up in Vermont, of all places, because of one social connection. I have an aunt that married an American. They happen to have a home in Shelburne at the time, and that is how my parents chose Vermont. They came here without college degrees. They didn't have any English skills when they moved, so their economic opportunities were relatively limited, but they still took that brave leap of faith to leave behind everything they knew to come to a country where they thought economic opportunity was abundant. That shapes how I approach my work with the Futures Project. We recently launched an economic action plan back in January. There's some copies of the full plan and some one-pagers over on that table. This plan is where I've been seeing some progress and pushback towards this idea of growth, and that'll be a theme on this panel. I'm the crazy guy that says we should grow our population to 802,000 by 2035. We can get into that in a bit. But the takeaway for me is it's about opportunity. How do we make sure that opportunity continues to be part of the Vermont narrative, not only today, but moving forward as well?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Bradbury. I'm a snowboarder, a recovering entrepreneur, and I live up north. It's great to be back in Mount Snow. I grew up in a small town that milk used to be delivered. Then it became the high-tech hub in Massachusetts. I went to UVM and have stayed and really tried to make a career at the intersection of higher education, entrepreneurship, and economic development. I was fortunate enough to spend 5 years in the Dean administration as Deputy Dave doing economic development all around the state, so it's great to be back in familiar territory. My wife and her family are from Guilford, so go Brattleboro, right? Here we go. And there you go. All right, yeah. We'll liven this room up a bit. Okay. And I went to UVM as well, and again have made a career in finance, startups, scale-ups, and trying to build wealth and income opportunities for my kids, your kids, and fellow Vermonters. For the last 17 years, I've been president of the Vermont Center for Emerging Technologies, or VCET. We're principally up in the northwestern part of Vermont, but purport to serve the state. What VCET does, we're a nonprofit with several for-profit entities, and we wake up every day and try to provide actionable advantages to the people that are starting or thinking about starting businesses here in Vermont. We do that through people, platform, and protein sources. The people are the mentors. We've got over 300 folks that we pull from, so you can get a smarter answer or a better piece of advice than you might get from me or my team. We do that with our staff, and we love how people describe our team. We're authentic in our zone around startups. We're trusted. We try to be empathetic. And we try to bring some expertise to this wild tech-enabled startup world. Platform. We used to call it places. We've owned and operated 3 different co-working spaces in 2 different counties. We've helped fund, form, and almost operate at points a few others, almost 6 others around the state. Because we want people to connect in real life, get them together in a maker space, a co-working space, a coffee shop. We believe good things happen when people come together to talk about their ambition, their problems, their futures. Other elements of the platform are content, Female Founders Series. We're in season 10 of our podcast, Start Here, which tells the story of active, aspiring, and accidental entrepreneurs. We believe that if you can see yourself as one of those wild-eyed entrepreneurs that defies logic, you know where to get help, you know where to get inspiration. In addition, perks. We give away a lot of stuff a year to companies. So if you use Stripe, if you need cloud credits, reach out to us at VCET. It's free. We don't ask for anything other than you get the magic code, and we hold our breath and hope it works for you. I think last year we were able to give out well over $500,000 to companies all around Vermont. And whether you take $50 off your monthly expense or $100,000 off it, it can really matter and make a difference. And the last is protein sources. That's a cute way of saying capital, whether they be grants or venture funds. VSET operates 2 evergreen venture funds, about $15 million. We've got a fresh $9 million fund that we're investing right now. The first fund, Fund 1, $6.5 million we've invested directly into 36 companies. They've raised an additional $600 million of other people's money. Like staggering. I never thought we would do that. And in fact, it wasn't us that did it, it was the entrepreneurs. So good on them. So I hope today to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, the capacity building in communities, and how to connect the dots for those that really want to take a business to the next level. And thanks for having me.
Okay, so up first is a question for Art. Art is an economist with deep Vermont experience. Can you walk us through how we should define a rural economy, especially one like Vermont's? What metric matters most to actually understand that if it's healthy or not?
So we all know Vermont's a rural economy, right? What exactly does that mean? Well, we're the second smallest state in terms of population. That's why I stood up. Thanks, Kevin. We are the second smallest state in population. Only Wyoming is smaller, so that must have something to do with rural. We don't have any big cities. In fact, the largest city in Vermont is laughably small. Right? I mean, Burlington. I admit I'm from Chittenden County, so I'll lay that on people. Burlington's got 40,000 people. The county's got a lot more, but Burlington's 40,000 people. A quarter of them are students, so they don't really count. So it's really a city of about 30,000 people. That's tiny. It's the smallest big city of any state. We have the smallest capital city of any state. Those are all kind of the way I think about rural. There's no big cities nearby. Montreal and Boston, well, sort of, but I wouldn't call them nearby, but they're there. If we look at kind of a formal definition of ruralness, density, population per square mile, we actually don't look so bad. About 70 people per square mile. The United States is about 90. Alaska's obviously down at the bottom. I don't know if it's Rhode Island or Hawaii there at the top, but so we're kind of not, if you measure it that way, maybe we're not so rural. We're kind of more average. But even the largest city in the state, I looked it up a couple days ago, Burlington, MSA, which includes Chittenden County then, and a few other towns and some other counties. We are the 289th largest metro area in the U.S., right in between Abilene, Texas, and St. Cloud, Minnesota. Now there's some cities you kind of want to enter. So yeah, we're rural. Okay, so we have problems because of that, and there's lots of issues associated with that. One issue is people don't like living in rural areas, and by people I mean kind of the average person. We are all, to use a lingo, I'm above average. We are not average, right? We are a self-selected group, and if we didn't like living in a rural state or a rural town, we wouldn't live there. Right? Most of us will leave, and we're not. But we're not like the rest of Americans. Most Americans, especially young people, which we've talked a lot about this morning, they want to live in metro areas. Maybe not right in the center of the city like you do when you're 20, in your 20s maybe, but metro areas, they're the growing parts of the United States. They're also, the growing parts of the United States are also warmer areas. People don't like cold weather either. Okay, they like oceans. We don't have one yet. There's a lot of problems, and why are those issues? Well, one issue that Josh did not raise, but I think it's extremely important, especially given the kind of people we want to attract to our area, whether it's metropolitan Burlington or not so metropolitan in Brattleboro or Bennington or any place in between, and that is what demographers call assortative mating. Right, not a great term. And what that means is people want to marry people like themselves, right? Back in the 1950s, Mad Men, which I didn't really watch the show, but you can get a CEO marrying his secretary, and I purposely use his because it was never a CEO marrying her secretary, right? didn't work back then. And it was common for college graduates to marry high school graduates or even high school dropouts. Not today anymore. Now you have college graduates marry college graduates. People with postgraduate education marry people with postgraduate education, which is one reason why Brattleboro Hospital, again, to reflect on a theme that was just talked about, why do you have so hard of a time attracting doctors here, or even in Burlington? And the answer is because that doctor has a very specialized skill. She is a pediatric pulmonologist, okay? And her husband is an attorney who specializes in corporate finance. And they're in their mid to late 20s, they're getting out of school, and they want to live somewhere, and so where are they going to go? They both get job offers. Maybe in Brattleboro, but probably not. Not a lot of jobs for corporate people that specialize in merger and acquisitions as lawyers in Brattleboro. Maybe they get one in Burlington. Brattleboro's got even more problems than Burlington. I like to use Burlington because it's got a problem itself. And they get a job offer. What a great place to live. Nice place to raise kids, beautiful scenery. I like to hike, I like to ski. It's right near Canada, just in case. And so then they start thinking about it. They think, well, we also got a job in Raleigh, North Carolina, and one in Denver, Colorado, and Austin, Texas. And which one should we take? Well, Burlington just sounds so nice. But what happens if we don't like our job? One of us doesn't like the job. You're a pediatric pulmonologist in Burlington, Vermont, and you don't like your job. Well, where else are you going to work besides the medical center? There's no other jobs. And if you're a corporate finance specialist, mergers and acquisitions, and you're a lawyer, maybe there's one or two law firms in Burlington. So that's going to push down the weight, say, Burlington doesn't look so good. Brattleboro, you got other problems in Brattleboro, right? I mean, only one of them can really get a job. The other one's got to have to do some commuting or think of something else to do. So those are some real problems that we have in terms of the ruralness of Vermont. Again, Burlington's got it, Brattleboro and Bennington have it in spades. Those are some big issues. Do you want me to let me stop, and I don't know how we're doing time-wise. I'm not looking. 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. All right. So, in terms of, I'll look a little bit about kind of where we are, is how good are we doing, and the answer is not very well. If we define an economy that's doing well, and this is kind of getting into it, I think a little bit later, but it's a place where people want to come, and people don't want to come to Vermont. I said people don't like rural areas. Well, they did in the 1960s and 1970s into the 1980s. People moved to Vermont because living in a small city or a small town had a lot of attributes. People's tastes and preferences change. And people's preferences for living in a certain area are a lot different than they were 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And the 1970s and 80s and 90s, or 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s, that's when Vermont's population grew, our economy grew. We were an attractive place because of what people desired. And not a majority, but a lot more than today. And that's something we have to face. We can't change people's preferences. We can change some things, but it's very hard to make people think that a rural lifestyle is what they want if they don't want it.
Great. Thank you, Art. Up next, a question for Mike. Mike is Vermont's treasurer and former financial regulator, Vermont State College trustee. You've seen the numbers that come with population loss and disinvestment. What are the long-term consequences for communities that stop investing in growth? And what should we leaders be looking for? And this is a 3 to 4 minute answer.
Is that?
And go.
Well, I think to start off, one of the challenges that we have, I think, in our state, and I know there's a question that we'll talk more about this in a little bit, and I think it talks a little bit about what Art's talking about too, is, I think Vermont has a problem with change. Vermonters have a problem with change, right? I think most fundamentally that's maybe our core issue. We don't want to change. We don't want to lose that ruralness of people that are here. But when I think about that, I think that we are constantly changing Vermont. We as people, we as communities, we as a state, we're in a constant state of change. And the question is not, are we going to change or are we not going to change? The question is, are we going to change for the better or are we going to change for the worse? Because we could continue to not make the investments that Adam's talking about or promote more housing or economic opportunity or workforce expansion or people moving to Vermont. It's not like things are going to stay the same. They're going to continue to get worse. And what does that look like? It's a big issue around affordability. You know, for a lot of the reasons that Art's talking about, we have a smaller tax base trying to cover a lot of the same services of a much bigger place. Think of the comparison between the entire state of Vermont and the city of Boston. You know, relatively similar populations, but then think about all the hospitals that we have to have because of how our population is situated. Think about all the elementary and high schools that we have to have because of the way our population is situated. Think about all the roads and bridges that we have to have compared to Boston because of the way that our state is set up. The opportunities for public transportation that exist in Boston that don't exist in Vermont. People don't have to own a car in Boston and they could get around the entire city. It's really hard not to own a car in Vermont, which adds to the affordability challenge as well. So we already have this affordability problem, but if we don't have a growing economy and a growing population, then we're going to have an even harder time affording the things that we have and that we need and that people expect, but with a shrinking tax base. So that affordability issue is really going to be paramount. And then there's an opportunity issue as well, lack of opportunity. So when there's not this growing dynamic economy, people don't have options in front of them. Young people in particular don't have options in front of them. So you may have a family that moves here, has 3 or 4 kids, but all of the kids end up moving somewhere else because it's hard to afford living here. And then there's that lack of opportunity for a job that shows promising economic mobility. And then that obviously impacts your demographics. As people get older, as you don't have as much inbound migration from other places, as the young people start to move elsewhere, then you have a shrinking workforce and a growing older population that needs more care and needs more services, and again reinforces this issue around affordability. You get into this really non-virtuous cycle where things cost more and you have fewer people to pay for them. So I think unfortunately that's what it looks like when you don't invest in growth. And you can see that in some of our towns. I mean, you can see that at a micro level where things are becoming less affordable, there's less opportunity, and it's older. And a lot of our more rural parts of our state look more like that than Burlington or Winooski or even Brattleboro, quite frankly. So that's the bleak image that is painted if we don't decide that we want to make change. We don't want change to happen to us. We want to make the change and create a better future for our local communities and for our state as well.
That's great.
I thought I was supposed to be the doomsayer.
Doom and gloom guy? Yeah. Stick with us, I promise. This gets more aspirational. Kevin, with your work at Vermont Futures Project, you see how policy and demographics intersect. Who is actually shaping our economy and who's being left out?
Thanks for that question, Adam. So in terms of what shapes an economy, right, there are external forces at play that we don't have direct control over, whether it's international geopolitics, national trade policy, regional priorities. But there is a lot that we do have control over as well. And Adam, I'd like you to pull up that map of latent capacity. So there has been growth in Vermont. And if this is hard to see, this is just a map that compares current population in each town to its historical peak. All the places that are green and blue on this map actually have fewer people today than they did at one time in their history. Growth has been clustered in and around Chittenden County and resort towns. So I share this because I've had people say to me, well, we're a small state, we can't possibly grow, and we don't have the carrying capacity for more people. That's the term that I've encountered multiple times. And I thought, we have the data to understand how much capacity some towns had, and there's a lot of latent capacity. Meaning, if we were to just play out a thought experiment and restore every town back to its historical peak, how many more people would that be? That would add over 70,000 people to Vermont. And that's just a rural revitalization strategy. So in terms of who shapes an economy, right, what's happening in and around Chittenden County influences the regions around it. But each town, each village, each place, each community has the opportunity to define a vision and values and priorities for themselves and start to work towards achieving that, right? That is a lever that you all have available to you, to yourself. And when you aggregate the sentiment of communities, you can really affect change. It's interesting, the words growth and development sometimes are thought of negatively, right? There's pushback against it because there can be negative impacts from it. But when I take a step back and I just think about growth and development at a personal level, no one has ever told me not to pursue personal growth. No one has ever told me that professional development is a bad thing. It's widely celebrated, right? So let's extend that same sentiment when we start thinking about communities and even at the state level, because that is taking control of our change when we can define growth towards what and for whom.
Great, thank you. And so, David, with VSET, you've supported startups and scale-ups in places not usually known for this historically. Can you talk about the role investment capital and entrepreneurial ecosystems play in actually shaping the greater Burlington economy?
Happy to, Adam. I'm stoked. I'm on the happy end of the table here because our team gets to see. We saw 377 doers and dreamers walk through our door last year looking for no-cost advice and asking how and where and with whom. Okay? Those are in every community around our state. I love the fact that we're still 2/3 dirt roads. And for those that are curious, there's one of three things up those roads. Dead-end stone wall, big mean dog, or a really cool entrepreneur. She might be building ADU housing, right? Awesome. So to me, that's sort of wedded to be optimistic when you're dealing with venture investing and trying to put capital into areas. So with respect to investing in Vermont and sort of the readiness, it's never been a better time. There are more capital sources through individuals, angels, through foundations, through grants, through corporations that are now here in our state, through new institutional venture funds. The SSBCI program that Joan Goldstein made happen is just hitting the street now, and that's $29 million of new seed capital that will be flowing in, another $29 million in lending capacity. So, take that 100x capital leverage number that we saw in our Fund 1, okay, and that is a lot of money. Now, too much capital too soon does a lot of really bad perverse things. So having a little scarcity, making it tough or tougher, not unattainable, is really helpful. So with respect to what we've learned that I think is relevant here, you need places to gather, okay? Virtual, in person, where you can do programming, you can explore ideas, you can just be silly, dream together. We've tried over the years in Brattleboro, Bennington a couple times, Manchester, Arlington. We're not giving up, and I hope you all don't give up, okay? And please, don't be afraid to ask a Main Street landlord, I need that building for 6 months. Let us just play. And if you need an inspiration, go to downtown Barrie, go to the Barrie Social Club. There's a new one in Waterbury, due north up in Linden, Space on Main, and a few others that really show the power of getting together. The other thing I think Vermont has that we could do a better job on is accessing our talent. People that are here part-time, full-time, they're Epic Pass holders, I don't care. They want to talk and learn a little bit. That's how we lull them in. It's a talent cloud. And to me, that's like cloud computing. It's infinitely scalable, it's virtually free, we just need to know how to curate that. So I think that's something that we can do. And last, I wish at the policy level that we actually took business owners and entrepreneurs a bit more seriously and recognize how difficult it is. It doesn't take a lot, just a little. Take some of the friction off, some of the frustration, make the information more accessible. All those things are endemic every other rural community. But here in Vermont, where we know one another better than most, I think we can just make it a little bit easier, and that amplifies forward. And I think we are in the business of entrepreneurship. Economies grow quickly one of three ways: Real estate, right? That's really a lot of speculation, a lot of rapid population growth. That's not us. It goes through financial speculation, which is really driven by tax policy and hedge funds and mystical financial instruments. Not us. And the third way is through business ownership and entrepreneurship. Okay, that's the business model we're in. That's the biggest source of income for our state, the personal income. So let's recognize that. We're here to learn today, and I'll get off the preach here, but I just want to be happy, Adam.
That's great. Well, thank you for helping change the mood. So we're going to transition into more of a panel discussion amongst each other. But first, just a bit of a read of the room. So we've heard this word growth. By a show of hands, who supports Vermont's economy growing? All right, seems pretty unanimous. Who supports your regional economy growing? Okay, we're doing great. Who supports your town's economy growing? Okay, and now ready to raise your hands if you support Amazon building a 300,000 square foot warehouse in your neighborhood. Okay, so we have we diverge, right? So we like growth, but not all growth may be good. Some of it may happen to you, or you may make some of it happen. So with that as a background, Kevin, can you start us off, and then everyone else on the panel will respond to this in their own way. Can you have thriving communities without growth?
Thanks, Adam. I want you to pull up the table with the employers by size and wages, just because you made that point about Amazon. I think a lot of folks that I talk to, let's keep going. A lot of folks that I talk to say that affordability is one of the challenges in Vermont. And there's a lot of focus on the wage side of this equation. So I wanted to share this data to show that we have a lot of small businesses in Vermont, very few medium and large businesses. But in terms of wages, we can also see that as firms grow in size, they can also pay more, right? So I just wanted to put that on the table, following Adam's comments about an Amazon facility in your backyard. Not to say that you should choose one or the other, but when we have these tough conversations as communities, we should start with data. Now, another one that I want to go to, and Adam, you skipped past it, it was the one on, are you supportive of new housing to grow the population? We can pause on this one and then go to the housing one. So this is a question that I had put in the Vermonter poll, which is run out of the University of Vermont annual opinion survey through the Center for Rural Studies. I don't know if Michael Moser is in the room. If he is, giving him a shout out. So this question, I was a little surprised by the results. I'll be honest, when I first asked it, I thought that younger respondents would say yes at the highest rate, and then older respondents would say no. I had my own biases, and I was wrong. And it's okay to look at data and say, I'm wrong. Happens to me every day. But what I take away from this is that overall, there are more people that say yes than no. And some of the age-specific responses highlight the impacts of scarcity. Younger respondents were saying no because they saw population growth as competition in the labor market, as competition in the housing market, whereas older Vermonters were saying yes because they were thinking about the practicalities of aging in their communities, access to services, healthcare, and this for me really highlights what scarcity does to impact our sentiment. Now there's another one, I think, on housing, similar format. So this is a question that says, are you supportive of new housing to increase the population in Vermont? Playing off of the framework that Adam had for us. Now, what if we get a little closer to home in your town? What about in your neighborhood? So you see a shift there when we go from Vermont to your town, the rates of yes responses go down a little bit, and then in your neighborhood, we see that shift to below 50% saying yes. I want your takeaway from this to be that at every scale, there are more people that say yes than no, even at the neighborhood scale. We might hear those no voices really loudly, but we have to work to empower those yes voices. That should be the takeaway.
Great, thank you. And David, you want to respond?
And that is fairly new, right? Where the sentiment has changed.
Yeah, it's actually gone up by even more. I just got new poll results a week and a half ago. I haven't had a chance to put it on a slide yet, but at every scale, it's gone up by 10%.
You know, I would, this concept of scarcity. So I did take Art Wolf's econ class at UVM, and
One of the few people that will
admit that. Yeah. Well, actually, the takeaway, it really has defined a lot of my thinking. It was the Econ 101, right? It's the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing interests over time. Right? Competing, allocation, scarce, time. And it's helped me think about, in terms of some of the economic development challenges, is, you know, how do we think differently about maybe things that always were, but may not be part of the future. So that empty lot that we've always used for pickup games, for town rec, maybe that is housing. State airports, do we have the right number of them? Right? Those are thousands of acres of flat land that could be infrastructure. Do we make that trade? Right? Several dozen airplane owners or 1,000 housing units. I'm not advocating for one, but I think those are those uncomfortable conversations we need to have happen. Are we over-resourced in college dormitories versus housing for young folks or remote workers? Again, those are things where we may be at a moment where we recognize we don't have a lot of green field to plow or flat land to, particularly in this area, to build effectively. So are there opportunities where we need to get more comfortable around trade-offs? Okay, and that, I think that is the inconvenient truth and the uncomfortable aspect of where we're at the micro level and certainly as a state. I don't have an answer, but I know that's got to be on the table.
That's great. And Mike, if you'd finish us out on this.
Yeah, well, you know, I was sort of reflecting on what Kevin said, and you know, if we think about this idea, particularly around housing and not having enough of it, and the challenges that it creates throughout our economy and throughout our state, those are challenging enough. But I think a piece of data that I think is really eye-opening that I always go back to is this data from the tax department that looks at income filers pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and how many in Vermont make over $100,000 adjusted gross income pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. And pre-pandemic, we had about 59,000 tax filers making $100,000 or more, 2019. And then in 2022, that number grew to 76,000 tax filers. So that grew by double digits. The number of people that were on the lower side of the adjusted gross income scale decreased. The number decreased by about 10 or 15,000 people, smaller percentage because it's a much bigger pool. But basically, you know, people that were coming to Vermont were earning bigger salaries. They were putting more pressure on our housing market. They're buying homes. They're driving up the cost of those homes. They're demanding different and more services. And for me, it's really focusing on those people that are in the middle and working class that are even having a harder time making it in Vermont, but they're the people that power our economy forward, and they're the ones that if we don't invest in and we lose more of, we're going to see that non-virtuous cycle that I was talking about a minute ago. So having that kind of pinpoint focus on strengthening, building, supporting the middle class in Vermont and the working class in Vermont, it doesn't just benefit them and their families, it benefits the entire economy, and something that we have to focus on. The other thing I just want to mention about this data that Kevin presented also on housing, you know, it's great, and I think it's a great point that every single one of those age groups supported more housing, and it's great that the data has gone up too, because housing's been an issue that we've had for a while, but I don't think that everybody was on the same page, that everybody agreed it was a problem. And before everybody can agree, you know, before you can solve the problem, everybody has to agree that it is a problem. So you can get discouraged about the pace of housing development, the pace of growth, the desire to have more of it because we need it so badly. But we have a growing important first step, which is a growing recognition that housing is critically short in Vermont and we need to build more of it, and there's more and more support for that among policymakers. But more importantly, among everyday citizens that are in Vermont that sort of show up to those meetings and drive the narrative, and at the end of the day, I think influence a lot of the local decisions.
Great, thank you. This next question is for David to kick us off with the respondents from the panelists. So David, a question around growth. We've heard how growth is good. Is all growth good, inherently good, or can some be bad?
I wish it were always good. It'd be easy, right? It's not. It depends, and that's such a cop-out answer. Again, I got that from Art Wolf's economics class. But again, it's the trade-offs, right? Growth in housing. I live in a ski town in Malone County, and great, we've got tons of housing. 2/3 of it, though, go to out-of-state residents or to short-term rental. Okay, so for us to make up just in that community the 500 units we need, we've got to build 1,500 units at that. So again, there are policy triggers, incentives around how you tax, how you make it accessible that you may be able to pull back some of that. Now, growth that sacrifices, I think shared values that we have. I think to the environment or to one another, to smallness in some form. Right? It could be the gathering center, it might be the school, it could just be another asset that brings us together is really important, but we might not be able to have it all. Okay, and I think that's where a small population is starting to crush us. The denominator is too small to support one in every location. And I don't know what the ones are, right? It could be fire departments, it could be school systems, could be banks, it could be VSETs and all the rest. We do need to find a way to improve our productivity. And I'm going to end this on something positive around productivity. I've had 2 conversations in the last week with small software companies that one of the metrics they use is what revenues do we earn per employee. Okay, and a decent one is $200,000 a year in income per employee. Okay, so these 2 right now, they now have a path toward $1 million per employee in revenue. Okay, using the AI tools that scare us to death. Okay, using other workflow changes. So that, to me, creates economic inflow, capital inputs, supports a smaller employment base that still grows sustainably and competitively. So those things are underpinnings. And another example is Waterbury, Vermont. We have 5 companies that we've invested in there now. 2 are in energy, one's in aviation, one's in solar panels. Waterbury used to be ice cream and coffee. Okay, now it's batteries. Okay, so, and that has happened within a 15-year period. Okay, so those things are happening. It gets really back to the velocity of capital talent in a community. And I think for a long time when I was in economic development, we were like, let's build a 100-year-old company. Well, that's maybe, but I think we're more apt to build 4 companies for 25 years because of the pace of change, the interests of generations that we saw in the data, what they want to do, how they want to do it will change. So I think that sort of nimbleness and makes me a bit uncomfortable as I think about it, but I think that's the world we're going to need to compete in, and my money's still on rural to win.
So Kevin, as you think about growth, good growth, is there some bad growth? What makes it bad?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that I didn't take an economics class in college. I'll share that I was actually an environmental studies major. That might surprise some folks. So when I think about growth, I certainly think through the holistic perspectives of the economy, the environment, equity, right? And there are certainly examples of growth having negative impacts, especially from an environmental perspective, or to increase inequity. And in those instances, growth can create negative results. But that isn't the only narrative. Growth can also be a positive to improve the environment, to increase equity, and it's about alignment, right? That was one of the themes that came up in Josh's keynote was how do we align what we have already with where we want to go? So growth, for me, I like to think through, this is getting really philosophical now, I think through the pursuit of happiness framework. Thanks for the claps, yeah. Right. In that, the growth that we pursue, whether it's at a personal level or at a community level, right, shouldn't negatively impact someone else through whatever perspective. And we need to be able to aggregate that at the community and the state level as well. We also have to ask, what are the impacts of not growing? We can't ignore the negative externalities of inaction. What do I mean by that? If someone can't find a home in the state of Vermont, they don't just disappear off the face of the earth, right? They become homeless in our communities or they move somewhere else. And this is where my environmental training will kick in. If they move somewhere else and then are participating in systems and structures that are actually less sustainable than what we have here in Vermont, that is a greater negative impact to global climate change. I'm really encouraged by the innovation and the desire to build solutions here in Vermont. So the growth that we have can help to scale up those solutions so that we start creating a bigger impact, positive impact on the world around us through growth.
Excellent, great. Art, some thoughts on growth?
Sure. Growth is always disruptive, right? I'm reading David McCulloch's book on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I like to use historical examples because it gets away the modern emotions, you know, we're in this. So think of all the ferry boat drivers and owners that were put out of business because the Brooklyn Bridge was built. Now, if they had all gathered and fought it and successfully, would that have been good? So there's always going to be somebody opposed to it. They could dress up their arguments in environmental guise or population guise or any other guise they want. But we got to remember that growth is inherently disruptive to somebody. But obviously the residents of New York City and Brooklyn all benefited tremendously from the Brooklyn Bridge. And there were a few thousand people probably that got hurt. And we should keep those kind of things in mind. And I think it was David who was talking about the airport. You know, do we need all the airports? We also need to think about when we listen to people and try to figure out what the community believes, which all of us, I think, want to do, and we have, you know, inordinate amount of public hearings. But you know, who's going to go to those meetings? It's the airplane owners, the 20 of them, right? As opposed to the 500 people that would benefit from 200 units of housing on that. So we have to remember that whenever we have any kind of change, there's also always going to be a very small group of people who either benefit tremendously or get hurt tremendously. There's a small group that get hurt, the ferry boat owners, and a large group that benefit, everybody else in Brooklyn and New York. You know, who's going to come out and protest? Right?
Very good.
And it works the other way around too, right? If there's a small group that benefit and a large group that really don't care, then who's going to benefit? My example of that is the U.S. sugar lobby, right? There's a few thousand beet sugar and cane sugar producers in the U.S. that influence sugar policy in the United States tremendously, benefit to the tune of, you know, probably hundreds of millions of dollars because we pay higher prices for sugar than we should if we bought sugar in the world, and we can't. And so we all, as Americans, all 330 million, 40 million of us, we each pay, you know, maybe $5 or $10 a year more. And those sugar producers reap that. So there's always a small group that are either getting hurt or benefit, and a large group that really doesn't care, but they should, but they won't. So we have to be careful about who we're listening to. You know, we have a public meeting. Right. Does that really tell us what the public wants? So we just saw the survey. Surveys have problems, but they do tell us something different than what we might hear if we go to a public meeting about building new housing in town X or county Y.
Thank you, Art. And Mike?
I'll just make a couple of points. I mean, I think about this question, the growth question. It reminds me of a profile that was done about the city of Houston and some other cities across the country looking at homelessness and the difference in homelessness rates in these places. And, you know, in the cities like Seattle, San Francisco, the point was it was really hard to build housing. And because the housing market wasn't elastic in responding to population changes, fewer people had the opportunity to have homes, and those that were most vulnerable ended up not having homes and then ending up into challenging situations, and for some of them, homelessness. But then in Houston, there's almost no limitation on the opportunity for growth. There's no land use regulation, there's no local zoning, and they had a very low homelessness rate. But when they described driving through city of Houston, they described a single home, a gas station, a manufacturing facility, an industrial site, a multifamily home unit, a gas station, a dry cleaner. And they said, you know, there's something that they're doing right here, but it's not totally right. And there's something that Seattle and San Francisco are doing wrong, but it's not totally wrong. So I think finding that balance is really important. And it's important for a state like Vermont because our advantage, I like to think of it as the Vermont advantage, is our natural beauty and our outdoor recreational opportunities. That's for a lot of people why they like visiting Vermont, why they end up moving to Vermont, why they stay in Vermont, and we have to protect those. But I don't think growing in Vermont is contrary to protecting our outdoor recreational opportunities and our natural beauty. I think they very much work hand in hand. And I do think we can get environmental benefits of doing growth in a smart way. But ultimately for Vermont, I think the thing that's most important about growth is the point about scale and trying to get more scale across our state so that we can sort of get into that more virtuous cycle of things costing less because there are more people to pay for them at a basic level.
Okay, so now we're going to come to our final question, but before we get to that, just by a show of hands, who works in an area where they think there may be a lever to control a piece of the economy, whether you're a business owner or how are you or your work somehow contributing to a potential growth? Okay, and then for people who are involved at a municipal level, do we have any municipal folks in the room? Okay, great. And then folks who are doing that work just at a statewide level, not specific to a particular community. Okay, so with that bit of a read of the room, our last question to the panel for discussion is, you know, what are the takeaways that we can give these folks on how to help grow their economy? So when we were discussing this as a group in prep, the conversation revolved around the amount of pushback we hear in Vermont about this word that we've excessively used here today, growth. And so, you know, how do we impart everyone here to have the tools, the language, the resources, the knowledge, the partners or the network to help them in whatever field you just raised your hand to help achieve that growth? So as we turn over to the panel, again, just further talk about this, but dialed into what are the takeaways for various audience members that each of you can speak to in particular around how they can help manifest growth in their functions. And we'll start with Kevin.
Thank you. I want to recenter us with some data. So Adam, could you go to the one with population and labor force? Just to bring back some of the themes that we heard from the keynote. I travel around the state quite a bit and I talk to folks about demographics, the labor force implications, the economy, housing, and I'll often encounter phrases like, we have a workforce shortage, or we're in a housing crisis. If I stop to ask, well, how many people do we need to fill that shortage? Or how many homes do we need to address this crisis? Very rarely do I get a direct answer, but these tools are available to us. This is where data can be really helpful to quantify what is that gap and how do we close it? What scale of action is needed? Not only at the state level, but all the way down to the municipal level as well. Right, because transformative change for the state is going to be the aggregation of local action towards a collective target. I mentioned the 802,000 as the goal that's established in the Economic Action Plan. That's an increase of about 155,000 people in the state of Vermont, which might sound really scary in our context. But that equates to about 2% growth per year over the next decade. That's a very different number, right? And when we put that into a local context, if you live in a town of 1,000 people, that means welcoming 20 new residents next year. I think we can get behind that. I see a lot of head nodding. Right, so we have to be able to make change feel a little bit less scary and talk about it in the context of the community that we're asking to change. And sometimes change itself is the difficult word, the barrier, because change can mean erasure, right? Change for indigenous communities in Vermont meant a lot of erasure. So I like to think about the process of adaptation, evolution. How do we enhance our communities to meet the needs of the people here and for the next generation? The 802 number, I'll end my comments with this because I often hear people say, well, I don't know if I can get behind that. That feels like a lot of people from Vermont. I don't want to turn into New Jersey. Right? Raise your hand if you've heard that sentiment. Yeah, we've all seen it. I've seen bumper stickers, there are lawn signs, there's a Facebook page. It's a strong sentiment. Again, this is where data can be helpful. So Art mentioned earlier that Vermont has a population density of about 70 people. New Jersey is 1,200 people per square mile. If we grow the population to 802,000 so that we adequately address our workforce shortage, we'd go from 70 people per square mile to 87 people per square mile. Do you know how big a square mile is? It's over 600 acres. So we have space. It's not that scary.
I like to think of it, Vermont has about 6.6 million acres and 640,000 folks. So it's about 10 acres per person. That's enough. All right, and it's more than Ireland. That's truly. So, very specifically, things that might be helpful or to think of that we've seen elsewhere. Copy examples at work. You may be familiar down here with like the open studio days for artists, right? Those yellow signs that are out there. What's the equivalent for open career day? Okay, that you take one of these Bennington Day or some other day where there's a commitment in a region to get kids out of high school, middle school, supervised to go see what careers are out there. I wish that had happened as our boys were growing up. So they just don't know what they don't know yet. So that is something I think could be neat. And again, make the business owner as important as the artist, the farmer, the educator. Number two, a couple years ago we shifted from trying to set up internships. It just seemed like such a heavy lift. So we had the word micro. Let's do micro internships, basically projects. Literally, we did it with UVM, launched it, we did it with Middlebury College, very successful. It just makes it easier for someone to say yes. And it's not a lifetime or a multi-month commitment. So try that out. Space. My first company that I got involved with, funded and built, I went to our Regional Development Corporation, Frank Coffey. I said, I need a room for some coders. He's like, well, I got a windowless utility closet. I said, how big? He's like, 20 feet by 50. I said, fine, we'll take it. Okay, so we got a windowless room for free, and we built a company, and we ended up selling that to about $12 million. His teacher and his student had founded the company in 4 years' time. So that was life-changing for them and those employees. But again, we asked for space. So those that might have space, underutilized or not, think about it. Take a chance on someone. And then last, the SSBCI, which is that venture capital program being launched by the state now. There's currently an open RFP by VITA for $10 million for a group, a region that wants to do it. I'm not aware of a fund that's applied from down this region. Maybe it's time, Adam, group out there. But certainly, we're able to support that and be a partner in it because that is foundational capital. It's meant to be generational, and I'd say go for it.
So I think the biggest problem is Vermonters' perception of what growth means. And if you ask the average Vermonter, like a Rorschach test, what's the first thing you think of when you hear the word growth? It's like sprawl, pollution, more people, nasty neighbors, all these negatives. And you ask them some positives, they probably have to think hard about one. So first step is at least get them to think that there are some positives. And number two, get them to realize that the positives outweigh the negatives. And that's hard to do because economic growth is incremental. It doesn't come in big jumps every year. U.S. per capita income, Vermont's, Brattleboro's, it's roughly 2% per year, which doesn't sound like much. You don't look back last year and say, gee, I'm 2% better off this year than I was last year. Isn't it great? But over someone's lifetime, that means income's going to go up about 4 times. So it's really hard to convince people that 2% is a big deal, and there's a huge difference between 3% and 1%. Right? And then how do we convince them that there are all these, other than just numbers like that, but what does economic growth give us? Well, it gives us new technologies, it gives us higher productivity, it gives us better health and longer life, which most people have a hard time arguing with those two. Life expectancy in the US in the last 40 years is up 4 years. That's not bad. Worldwide, it's up about 15 years. And we've lived through, in the last 40 years, the biggest expansion of wealth and the biggest reduction of poverty the world has ever seen. That's because of growth. I think the health part is really important. Most people say, well, that's medical technology, but you can't have better medical technology unless you have more income so you can spend it on the research and the doctors and everything else that goes along with that. And so even in Vermont, in the last 30 or 40 years, infant mortality has gone down from about 7 babies dying before their first birthday per 1,000 born, down to about 3.5 or 4. It's in half. That's a big decrease. That's 25 babies that don't die each year that would have died in 1980. Why? Because we're richer. We can afford all the stuff that goes along with that reduction in infant mortality. So I think that the big task, whether you're a local economic development agency or just a normal person, convince people that there's all sorts of good things that go along with growth to counter their negatives.
I'll just make a couple of points, and I think everybody did a really great job answering this question. But I think the 2 points I want to make is the narrative, which you heard a little bit about, and then examples, which I think Dave was really spot on with. But that narrative, I think, is so important because the example I use is housing. And the way I talk about housing whenever I talk about it is not simply on the economic side. I think housing is our number one economic issue. I can talk about that all day long. But the number of employers I talk to who say they can't find people because those people can't find houses all across Vermont, is never ending. And it's clear that the lack of housing is holding back the full potential of the Vermont economy. But I also say it's our number one social issue. You see that Vermont has one of the highest rates of homelessness in the country. You look at a book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, and it tracks that a shortage of housing leads to an increase in homelessness. When you have vacancy rates that are low, and you have median rents that are high, you have more homelessness in your community than you do if those numbers are inverse. We have a hard time treating addiction and mental health because our housing first policies can't be implemented when we don't have houses to put people to get them stable and get them on the road to recovery. Things like healthcare costs are more expensive because we have to hire traveling nurses because permanent nurses can't afford to live in our communities. People that are homeless are going to the emergency department. They're getting their health care there. They're getting it at the most expensive place they can get their health care, and it's being absorbed into the system. Our demographics are such that we don't have the right mix. We have too many older Vermonters that need health care and not enough younger Vermonters paying into the system that don't quite need it. That sort of generational agreement that happens in the healthcare insurance space. So it's not just an economic issue, it's a social issue. And I just have a hard time believing that no matter what ideological sort of position you have, what political party you belong to, that you can't find something in that narrative to support and understand why we need more housing. So I think the narrative is really important to bring people together and build the coalition. And then I think the examples are really important. Are folks here from Bellows Falls today? So, the first time I was in Bellows Falls for a while after having grown up in Brattleboro, it was a couple of years ago, and I was walking around the downtown, and I called my mom and I said, "Mom, you're not going to believe it, but the next time I visit, we need to go to Bellows Falls and go to dinner." Because growing up in Brattleboro in the 80s and 90s, Bellows Falls had a lot of challenges, and people wouldn't go there. And it's a very different place now. And there are other examples in Vermont, like St. Johnsbury or St. Albans. So all are using different techniques to make their communities different, unique, thriving, growing. But having conversations with those city leaders, I think, is really important to learn from them about what their techniques and strategies were.
That's great. So, thanks, Mike. Kevin's got another topic to cover real briefly, and then we're going to go into Q&A.
Yeah, really briefly, just in terms of the leadership that's needed, right? I think there's always this desire to create new programs or policies to try to respond to the challenges, to create solutions, but sometimes the leadership that's needed is actually barrier deconstruction. What's getting in the way? What are we willing to let go of, right? Trade-offs, because that in itself can unlock a lot of efficiency towards collective goals. And I want to bring us full circle because David mentioned a definition for economy earlier. Could you repeat that for folks?
The allocation of scarce resources amongst competing interests over time.
Did you get that right, Art? Okay. I'm going to offer a new definition. And again, this is from someone who never took an econ class. The economic growth means more needs of more people are met more of the time. And if you can let that be your guiding light, the growth in your community will benefit everyone there.
So thank you. We do have a few minutes for questions. So we do have a microphone, or if you want to just pop up and ask it. Pat.
Hi, I'm Beth Walsh. I work at Vermont State University in Johnson, and I am director of a grant-funded program, crossing our fingers, called Road to Success, where I support rural Vermont students meet some of those barriers. And I would propose that growth doesn't necessarily mean bringing more people into the state, but it means keeping more people in the state, because so many of our rural Vermont students, they do a great job graduating from high school, and then they don't do a great job going on to college. And when they do, they often leave the state in higher numbers than any other state in the union. So we need to make sure that we are continuing to support post-secondary ed, whether it's a certificate, whether it's a training, whether it's an associate's or a bachelor's or whatever it is, so that our students see that as a possibility for them, because so many of them don't think it's an option. They haven't had the AP courses other students have had from larger schools. They haven't been able to do a part-time job even, or an internship, because they don't have transportation to get there. So I'm really here so that we can start including post-secondary ed in economic development discussions, because I think that's where it belongs, and definitely need more housing.
Thank you. Sue Coakley. I chair the Planning Commission in Putney, which is kind of a poster child for NIMBY, I'd have to say. But we're overcoming that, I have to say. We just broke ground on the big project. And I attended a community meeting with the opponents yesterday about how are we going to do ADUs all around our town. So we've changed the conversation. And one important thing I want to say that I didn't hear come up in this conversation, I'd like to hear you maybe address, to grow sustainably, and I'm going to go back to the environmental paradigm that Kevin, you're talking about, that's my background, is how do we make better use of our assets? We have a tremendous amount of underutilized assets in Vermont. So the growth you're talking about that provides equity and opportunity for everybody makes better use of what we have. Our housing, we used to have 3.5, 4 people per house. We're down to 2.1. It's older, it's not meeting the needs. We're underutilizing housing. We have underutilized of transportation assets. We have underutilized of buildings of all kinds. We're not utilizing the gray hairs, right? The older people who have the knowledge and capability. And as I think about that, and I have lots of ideas, but I'm wondering about how we use AI to help us accelerate better use of those assets in our economy.
Great. And so you all have already met Meg or heard from Meg, and she is a taskmaster. And so we have 3 minutes to wrap up this answer. So do I have anyone from the panel who would like to address that?
My flippant answer is ask AI what AI would do.
Quick response to both comments is yes and, right? We need to pursue both efficiency strategies. How do we do more with what we have in terms of labor force participation, removing barriers, aligning education to employment, and in terms of housing, how do we use those underutilized resources? So those are efficiency strategies. And again, this is where data is really helpful, because if those strategies alone don't close the gap, we also need expansion strategies. It's a yes and, right? From a labor force perspective, there's about 17,150 retirements per year, and we have about 5,300 12th grade students in the state of Vermont. Those numbers don't balance out. We don't retain 100% of those students, and even if we did and kept all of our college grads, and by the way, Vermont has the lowest college graduate retention rate of any state. So even if we increased college and high school graduation retention to near 100%, we would still need some level of inbound migration to balance that equation. So it's a yes and.
Unfortunately, it's really going to be a great time for those that are now retired to go back to work. The calculus on hiring full-time employees, no matter the revenue per employee, is changing. Take health care premiums as an example. Okay, a family plan at $30,000 a year is about $15 per hour equivalent, right? Versus bringing in somebody part-time that may have health benefits elsewhere. So, you're going to see that welcoming back into the workforce. Now, how technology and AI can be used to be more assistive to any worker, either without the specific skill or due to age and certain things. We have a robot company that's replacing the dull, dirty, and dangerous tasks. Okay, loading slate onto the back of pickup trucks, moving boxes, packing. So that's happening. So I think it may not happen fast enough to meet the targets that we need, but Kevin hit the nail on the head. It's both and.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking our panelists for their time today. I gotta remember what I'm supposed to do here. Hold on.
Let's give Adam a round of applause, too.
So up next, we do have those awards. I do have the microphone. Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation is seeking a controller position. If there's anyone interested, if you're not employed, only if you're not employed, please come see me. Thank you, everybody.